Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you listened to my story. Please give me a follow and like the video if you enjoyed it. Feel free to comment and provide feedback so I can improve the sound quality. Yes, I will now continue the unfinished story. Adventures of the Randy Elfmaid Book 3. Chapter 1. Aha! Victory is ours! I cried, rising up in the direhawk's saddle. The giant black warbird let out a piercing cry of his own. My battle joy was transmitted to him through the enchanted circlet around my head, which also gave me control of him. His wings snapped as he flew towards battle. The wind lifted my long black braid like a banner, while rustling my clothes. I didn't wear any armor since the lighter his load, the better the direhawk could fly and maneuver. Du Vessa! Captain Elgin cried to my left. He pointed at orcs charging across the nearby border. I frowned. That was awful bold of them to cross the border like that, especially coming to the aid of fleeing Orcish raiders. Yet, orcs were nothing if not recklessly bold. I quickly looked over the battle raging below my squadron of elfin air cavalry, while a human regiment of heavy cavalry charged towards the orcs far below. I watched as 4 direhawks carrying wicker baskets full of head-sized stones released their contents as they flew just 100 feet above the orc column. The heavy stones hit the ground, bounced, and blasted through the column of orcs in 4 places. The orcs knew the tactic, so a lot of them managed to drop to the ground and avoid being pulverized to death. Still, the elfin attack swept a lot of them away. Glancing at the heavy, barred wagons holding the elfin and human captives, I grimaced and shook my head when one basket of stones came dangerously close to them. They were grouped in the middle of the long column, so it was easy to spot them and avoid any attacks that threatened the prisoners. It was our task to free those prisoners, not kill them. The human heavy cavalry crashed into the orcs' flank. The human troopers outnumbered the orcs 2-1, but the orcs were massive monsters of pure fury. The humans' only advantage was their horses. The heavy cavalry cut the orcs off from the wagons, as troopers leapt from their mounts to break open the locks. The orcs' ferocity was intensified by their precarious position. Despite their size and strength advantage over the humans, few wore any armor. Most of them barely wore anything at all. The elfin archers riding the direhawks were brutally decimating their ranks. All of the orcs turned and surged toward the wagons. I rose up in my saddle and gave an elaborate signal with one arm, forming the squadron in a long line, and then I led the attack to aid the human soldiers. Die! I cried, loosing another arrow as we swooped past the fight on the ground. I turned in the saddle to watch my last arrow until it ripped through an orc's throat. Ha! Commanders! Prepare to land and engage. I studied the battle as my direhawk swung around. The fight raged upon the last hill before the border to the wastes. The orcs swarming across the border to assist their terrible brethren were closing faster than anticipated. This was our last chance to save the captives from the horrors of Orcish slavery. The orcs' elfin and human captives were all locked within 3 wagons. They were huge wagons, built of thick ironwood and pulled by a dozen oxen each. Those wagons could hold up to 50 captives, but the orc raiders hadn't been that successful. I knew of only 8 elfin captives, with there being 3 humans for every elf down there. The raiders had 2 other wagons carrying their gold, silver, and other loot. Greedy idiots, I whispered. Too many of the humans were trying to capture the treasure wagons. So frustrating. All I cared about were the prisoners. Cursing the troopers' greed, I gave my mount a mental command to land atop the centermost of the 3 slave wagons. The raid never reached the Emerald Forest, so the prisoners were all elfin traders and understood the danger of visiting towns and cities so close to the wastes. Fortunately, I was visiting one of the fortresses along the border with the human kingdom of Mayer when a royal messenger arrived requesting assistance. Since there were elves captured, I couldn't refuse the request. Of course, the chance to fight orcs was always welcome. Arrows, stones, and spears arched up towards me as my bird swept in to land upon the wagon. The weight of the giant direhawk rattled and rocked the wagon, and I immediately shot an arrow through the orc teamster. After slinging an extra quiver over my shoulder, I cried out with battle joy and leapt off my mount. Yes! Kill them! I cried, even as I used what little magic I'd manifested to slow my fall. I shot arrow after arrow as I descended to the driver's empty seat. The humans were still mostly trying to capture the treasure wagons. Damn you, fools! Forget the treasure! Save the prisoners! A human trooper pounded the large iron lock on the back of the wagon with a sledgehammer. I felt his mighty pounding through my feet. After another 3 strikes, it broke open. Elves and humans poured out and were escorted by humans as they raced towards the cavalry's reserves and freedom. Heed the rear! Those damnable orcs are attacking in force! I cried, pointing with my bow. The orcs at the back of the column were fighting much more fiercely, and slowly gaining the upper hand. I started loosing arrows at them, striking down orc after orc. Then an orc came up behind me on the wagon. Yikes! He carried a vicious-looking axe. I barely had time to parry his first strike with my bow, which completely destroyed my primary weapon. Pulling my sword, Fawn, just in time to parry his next stroke, I ducked and sliced his left thigh. Aff, he growled. Die, elf. He was as big and ugly as they came. I guessed he was at least 2.5 feet taller than me, with a thick, burly body rippling with muscles. All he wore was a leather loincloth held on by a wide belt. His skin had the texture of a toad's and was a dark gray color. His face was the most horrific of all, with a huge hawk nose, massive jutting jaw, and 2 tusk-like teeth coming out of his lower jaw. He was probably 3 or 4 times my weight, and strong as an ox. The second wagon's lock finally shattered, and more prisoners rushed off to safety. 1 more wagon to go. Once all of the prisoners were free, my squadron was out of there. If the humans wanted the stolen treasure, they could have it. None of it was elfin, so I wouldn't get a cut even if I helped. I will eat your stinking heart, the orc bellowed. He swung that huge axe around in a great arch, trying to decapitate. I ducked, and then leapt up over the backswing. Then I darted in to bloody my sword in his butt cheek. Well, I was trying to stab him in the gut, but he twisted around remarkably fast. Have you smelled yourself? I cried. You stink worse than a week-old dead goat. 3 arrows, shot by 3 different elfin warriors, sank into his neck, chest, and right side just below the ribs. He stiffened, snarled, and then slowly toppled backwards off the wagon. Thanks! A thunderous war cry rose up toward the front of the column. The other force of orcs was almost upon us. My gut clenched. We only had minutes left before they joined the battle and we were all swept away. I looked at the third wagon just as that lock failed. Seeing the last of the prisoners flooding out and running like crazy, I grinned and tapped a gemstone on the circlet, centered on my forehead. When I spoke, my voice boomed across the battle site. Mission accomplished. The prisoners are free. Fall back. I cried. Everyone, fall back now. Eagle Squadron, take flight. That little burst of magic burned through my youthful body. My mother, a high lady of the Emerald Forest, could do that as easily as I breathe. But I was still coming into my magic, so it was hard and took a lot out of me. I had to pause and suck in a deep breath, center myself, and envision rising up to the direhawk's saddle. I lifted up, rising faster than I'd ever tried towards the saddle. Oh! I cried when an orcish arrow flew between my legs. I was suddenly a very visible target. Only a few elves had magic, so that showed them I was noble-born and an officer. I reached the saddle, and settled in quickly. Ha! Fly! I mentally commanded my direhawk. A stone whacked him in the beak, making the bird squawk and jump backwards. I hung on, cursing myself for not strapping myself in immediately. Then the direhawk leapt up and I almost fell out of the saddle again. By the fifth stroke of his powerful wings, I had the safety strap buckled. "Take that, you stupid orcs!" I cried. An orcish spear came out of nowhere and transfixed my direhawk's neck. I gawked at it in horror as he flapped his wings ineffectually. My heart in my throat, I held onto the saddle for dear life as he fluttered one last time, managing to fly to the head of the column, and then died midair. Oh shit! I crashed right in the middle of the approaching orcs. It was a terrible jolt that snapped my safety strap. I went head first over the top and hit the ground hard. Pain lanced through me, so intense I couldn't even scream. Black and white flashed behind my eyes, and then I felt a huge hand yank my head up. "Oh," I managed to say when a bestial face thrust into mine. The ugliest grin imaginable spread across his face. I fought desperately to stay awake, but darkness quickly consumed me. "Oof!" I cried, my breath rushing out when my orcish handler kicked me between the shoulder blades. I went face down in the dirt, my wrists tied behind my back. Struggling to my knees, I glanced back at him with a scowl, and then looked past him. The only thing left to show there was a battle upon that hill were 3 broken wagons. The sky was empty. I wasn't conscious for it, but my captors said my men tried to rescue me 3 times. They only called off the attempts once I was taken across the border. "This is it," a big orc in mismatched steel and bronze armor said. He was standing in front of me, flanked by more orcs in even less armor. The fact he had armor meant he was important. One puny little elfmaid? The warlord surprised me, since the beast was clearly only half orc. From his tilted eyes and pointed ears, his mother was probably an elfin captive. That thought made my lower belly clench and a hard knot form between my legs. Mama will be so pissed if I come home with a half-orc baby, I thought. If I ever got to go home. Having orcish babies was the least of my concern. Orcs ate humans and elves. Word was, they'd eat each other too if there was no other meat available. "They surprised us, warlord," my handler said. "But this isn't just any elfmaid. She has magic." They negated what little magic I had with an enchanted collar around my throat. Iron can't be enchanted, but the gemstone embedded in it easily held the spell. I looked longingly back across the border. At least I freed the prisoners. I wasn't feeling all that accomplished. We were in the Orcish kingdom of Ura. It used to be a human kingdom before the orcs conquered it 25 years earlier. The leader of the conquering orcs named himself king. Normally orcs were too savage, too lawless to live in a civilized organized way, but somehow King Fulk managed to keep his kingdom together. Most of the orcs lived in nomadic hordes led by warlords. Whoever was the biggest, meanest, most murderous of the horde got to be warlord. Yeah, I was less than excited to meet my first Orcish warlord. "A noble," the Orcish warlord said. He grabbed my thick braid and yanked me to my feet. "Will the elves pay ransom for you?" My feet barely stirred the dirt beneath. I don't know what hurt and felt more strained, my scalp or my neck. Fighting the urge to kick him between the legs, I sucked in a deep breath through my teeth and glared into his bug-ugly face. "Yes," I said. "I am Duvessa, daughter of the High Lady. They will pay my weight in gold." That was going to be so embarrassing. I couldn't imagine anything more humiliating than the Emerald Forest forced to ransom me from orcs. And then the warlord ripped off my shirt. I discovered there was something even more humiliating than being ransomed. Before I knew it, another orc ripped and cut off my pants and boots. "Oh, that is so rude," I whispered. "We haven't begun to be rude to you, Elfmaid," he said. "I am Jars, warlord of the Red Horde and general of the Uran army. You are my prisoner, Duvessa of the Emerald Forest." Chapter 2. The column came to a slow stop between 2 hills overlooking Al Shardin. The kingdom of Ura's capital was typical of the humans in that desert region. It was big for the area, with whitewashed buildings and many domes and temple spires. Well, the whitewash was mostly weathered away. I could see teams of humans whitewashing 2 buildings in the middle of the city. The wall surrounding the city was still down in a few places, though I could see they were working to repair the breaches. After 25 years, you'd think the walls would have been fixed decades earlier, but orcs were nomads. The orcs didn't build, so relied on captured humans and elves to build and maintain their few cities and towns. My handler forced me to my knees. He pushed my face into the dirt, before placing his foot on my head. He did that a lot. Very irritating. I accepted it docilely, since I was naked, wrists bound behind my back, and he was many times my size. I sat back on my legs after his little dominance display. I ground my teeth, covertly glancing at his tented loincloth. They were constantly trying to get their cocks inside me. To my surprise, none of them forced the issue. I either did or didn't. Of course, that didn't keep them from trying to get between my legs. He laughed, holding out a lambskin water bladder. My throat tightened as I gazed longingly at it. My mouth was so dry, and they kept me at the verge of dehydration, so I was a little queasy. Unfortunately, everything they offered came with a price. "Water?" he asked. I gave him a dirty look, shook the hair out of my face, and then pointedly glanced at the city in the near distance. I was hot and sweaty, desperate for food and water. The bastards never gave me enough in the hope my will would break and let them take advantage of me for more food and water, but I won our battle of wills. I made it to Al Shardin before they broke me. If the trip was a few days longer, they might have succeeded. "I'm good," I said. He just laughed. I could tell he wasn't pleased, but we both knew I'd soon be giving to another. From what I'd gathered during the week-long trek through the desert, all of the slaves in El Shardin lived in one building. The orcs called it the slave pen. The slave master of that facility would provide all of my needs soon enough, so I didn't need to spread my legs for my captors. I wagged my brows at him to rub it in. Yeah, I can never leave well enough alone. He grabbed a fistful of hair at the back of my head, and then yanked my head back so hard pain lanced through my neck and down my spine. I cried out despite my determination to show them only cold contempt. My handler looked my dusty, sweaty nakedness over hungrily. "You think you're special, don't you, princess?" he growled, thrusting his face so close to mine our lips brushed when he spoke. "The warlord won't be around to protect your virtue once you are turned over to the slave master." My breath caught, and I cut my eyes to his obvious arousal. He grabbed his crotch and chuckled darkly. "I'm a prisoner, not a slave," I said. "What does that have to do with anything?" The warlord's approach claimed both of our attention. My handler released me and stood before his leader. I looked between them and Al Shardin. I was starting to get worried again. Jars carried a leash and iron collar in one hand. I hadn't been collared since the 3rd day of captivity. I hated it, so swore I wouldn't attempt escape so they'd remove it. It was so humiliating and degrading. The iron collar that suppressed my magic was replaced with another talisman, an enchanted nose stud. And my nose wasn't pierced prior. Ouch. In a way it was worse than the enchanted collar, because the spell on the silver stud constantly tickled my nose. I think they created it like that just to torment me and remind me they took away my magic. Orcs were cruel like that. Jars wore his armor, which he hadn't worn since the day I was captured. It was much too hot for that. Apparently, his mismatched panoply was good enough to be considered parade armor among the orcs. "Chin," Jars commanded, opening the hated collar. It was a little rusty, so the hinge squeaked. I've never had such an important prisoner to parade through the city. I sent a messenger ahead to ensure everyone knows just who you are. "How wonderful for you," I said. Taking a deep breath, I rose up higher on my knees and lifted my chin. My handler held my hair out of the way while the warlord snapped the collar around my neck. It was a snug fit, cold and abrasive. I caught his eyes, showing him my disdain. Does it make you feel like a man to lead me around like this? He pulled me to my feet with the leash. I gasped and struggled. Jar's free hand cupped my crotch. I stiffened, eyes huge as I stared up at him. If I want you to make me feel like a man, Elf, then you'll feel it down here, he growled. He released my sex to grab his own. But you'll feel it all the way up to your throat, too. I held my tongue and averted my face. Jars had the authority to do anything he wanted to me, up to and including killing me. He gave the impression he'd throw me on the ground and ravage me if I challenged him in the least. Really? Jars said. You have nothing else to add? That's a first. A girl has to learn to pick her fights, I said. You're not as dumb as you look, he said. I bit my tongue. You are too kind, sir, I said. The warlord just grunted and turned on his heel. I followed behind, at the end of his leash. So demeaning. All I could do was accept my fate, and hope the Emerald Forest paid my ransom quickly. My captivity wasn't going to be pleasant. The trip to the city gates went fast. 100 of the warlord's favorite warriors preceded us into the city. None of the orcs even attempted to march in military precision. One and all swaggered. I swear, every orc thought he was the biggest, baddest, meanest warrior alive. The streets were lined with shouting, cheering orcs. I saw my first female orcs, who were all twice as big as me, but much smaller and slimmer than the males. Male and female alike only wore poorly cured pelts around their waists. Their loincloths were held up by wide belts with elaborate brass buckles. They were all covered with tribal tattoos, scarring, and piercings. Sprinkled in among the orcs were much smaller elves and humans, and even a few goblins. Even the goblins I spotted wore the brass collars of slavery. Though, the fact all of the slaves wore pale brown tunics was a relief. The streets twisted and turned, rising higher and higher as we neared the center of the city. I could see our destination well before we arrived. It was a massive castle perched atop the highest place in the city. The streets were dirt. The buildings were mostly 1- and 2-level mud brick structures, with a few of stone. I was surprised by how many completely collapsed and never rebuilt mud brick homes still remained. There was a wide plaza before the city castle. Orcish warriors wearing bright silk loincloths stood in ranks before the castle gates. Male and female orcs in silken robes of every color filled that plaza. Orcish nobility? I said. You guys really are trying to become civilized, but... The biggest, ugliest-looking orc I'd ever seen stood front and center. He alone didn't wear silk. His loincloth was tool leather, dyed black with red trim. His naked upper torso was covered in tattoos and battle scars. His left tusk was broken and jagged, and he even had facial scars. He was barefooted, and carried a huge battle axe with silver decoration. "Hail, Folk!" Jars cried, coming to a stop. "Master of the 7 hordes." "That is one butt-ugly orc," I muttered. King Folk looked me over with the fiercest gaze. It scared me witless. My skin goosefleshed and I struggled to breathe as I trembled before him. Then he looked past me, and his eyes narrowed. "You march through my city in triumph, yet I see only one pathetic little elfmaid," King Folk said. His voice was a deep, rumbling, kind of scary. His fists tightened, and I watched thick muscles ripple across his chest and broad shoulders. I expect more from my generals, especially my own son. That surprised me. I'd never heard the Orc King had any children. Jars didn't look like him, except in a general Orcish way. He must have taken after his elfin mother, who was probably a lot like me. A prisoner or slave. That realization turned my insides into a hot mess, and a tingle started deep in my sex. I closed my eyes and sighed. Mother was really going to be pissed if I returned with the Orc King's baby. Can't say I was too thrilled with the prospect either. Fortunately, my fertile period was still months away, But sometimes ransom negotiations for royalty could take months to complete. She's a princess, Jars said. She is worth many times her weight in gold. Hey, I never said many times my weight. I told them I was worth my weight in gold. That mistake wasn't going to help my ransom negotiations. I have gold, Folk said. I want elfin slaves to grovel at our feet. I groaned. I promised I wouldn't try to escape, but that was only for the trip to Al Shardin. Now it was imperative I escape, and as soon as possible. Folk didn't sound too enthusiastic about my ransom, which didn't bode well for my prospect in his tender mercies. Well, that just sucks greasy orc balls, I said. I meant to whisper it softly, but it came out loud enough for that bestial king to hear. His gaze burned into me. Oops. Sorry. I'm Duvessa, the aforementioned princess. Though, technically, elves don't have princesses. My people will still pay a handsome ransom. They'll expect you leave me unmolested, of course. I heard laughter in the ranks of Orcish nobility. Neither Folk nor Jars looked amused. Jars looked at me like he wanted to cut my throat. Folk's gaze was cold and uncaring. We'll see, the Orc King said. Folk turned to a male elf in a red silk tunic. The elf snapped to attention. Slave master, have her bathed, perfumed, and brought to my bed. Hey! Don't I have a choice? I cried. The king gave me a dirty look. I almost peed myself. I would, of course, choose to maintain cordial relations. King Folk stepped up close. He grabbed my chin, squeezing until my eyes burned and tears rolled across my cheeks. Then he looked at the warlord and shook his head woefully. I am not pleased with your failure, Jars, Folk said, turned, and strode back into the castle. The elfin slave master hurried over to me. Jars handed him the leash. Come with me, Duvessa, the slave master said. He was tall and slim, with shoulder-length brown hair and brown eyes. A silver slave collar encircled his neck. I am Colin. A pleasure, I'm sure, I said, still watching the king as he vanished into the castle. The nobility immediately dispersed. No one gave me a second look. I was nothing to them. Really, it was a humbling experience. Men of all races tended to fawn over me. Once Folk and Jars were gone, I looked Colin up and down more critically. How did you get to be slave master? Just lucky, I guess, he said. Colin untied my wrists, and then led me towards the castle by the leash and collar. Come with me. I rubbed my wrists and hands, working feeling back into them. My nose itched like crazy, thanks to the nose stud, but my hands needed attention first. I'll follow you without the leash. I promise, I said. When he ignored me, I lifted my left hand to my face. I vigorously rubbed the underside of my nose, and then pinched it. My fingers touched the talisman in my nose. A-A-A-I-I-E. Intense pain ripped through my body, from head to toe. By the time I became coherent, I was flopping on the ground. Colin stood over me shaking his head. Don't touch the nose talisman, he said. He sounded more put out by everything than anything else. The punishment will get worse each time. Someone could have warned me, I croaked out, slowly regaining control of my body. This way has more impact, Colin said. At least he didn't look pleased. The orcs that captured me would have hooted with glee. I did notice the gate guards were watching up with big grins. I rolled to all fours, taking longer than I really needed to recover while I secretly studied them. Once the king passed inside, all semblance of discipline melted away. They moved around and talked like they were on personal time. The castle looked impressive, but was designed to keep the enemy out. I didn't think it would hold me for long. Escaping the nose stud suppressing my magic would be more difficult. Get up, Colin said, sounding annoyed. You're not going to escape. The orcs are the greatest, most powerful people ever. No one has ever escaped. You're an optimistic fellow, I said. When I stood up, I noticed how Colin looked me over. I knew what raw lust looked like. I wagged my brows at him. Hey, baby, wanna have some fun? It was a joke, a taunt. I think he took me seriously. I would be executed for soiling your body before the king has his fun, he said. My, what a romantic you are, I said. Get any notions of romance out of your head, Devesa, the slavemaster said, his face cold and bleak. You are nothing but property to the orcs. They will fuck you. Often. They will have a good time doing it, but there will be no heart or soul in it. You're just a warm body to spend their lust into. If you can make it more fun for them, smile and submit quickly and eagerly, then they will be nicer to you. Maybe I want to be nice to you, I said. I slanted a sultry look at him. He looked alarmed. I pressed up against him, lifting my lips up close to his. Don't you like girls? Colin looked all around as he pushed me away, but I felt the rise between his legs first. Of course I like women, but I think you want more than I can give you, he said. I will not help you escape. I scowled at him. If you want to be ransomed off, then I suggest you be extra nice and accommodating in bed with King Fulk. He hasn't decided to ransom you back to your people. If you don't make him happy, he'll make you very unhappy. I arched a brow at him, and then glanced up at the castle towers. Was my performance in bed truly going to decide my fate? Don't worry about me, Colin, I said. I caught and held his gaze. I'm going to make that butt-ugly bastard very happy. I want him to miss me when I'm gone. Chapter 3. Colin led me to the main keep, and then to the third level above ground. A dozen slaves waited, male and female, elfin and human. They were all naked, and proceeded to give me the bath of my life. I stood in their midst while they poured buckets of tepid water over me, scrubbing every square inch of my body. One very handsome human had a knack for touching my clit, over and over and over. I really think he was covertly trying to make me come. I wasn't fighting it, either. The whole affair left me panting and highly aroused. Holy oak! Is that an Orcish bath? I said. Two other young human men started rubbing body oils into my skin. They started on my breasts, with looks on their faces like they were having the time of their lives. Oh, baby, be gentle. I'm a delicate flower. Once my body was gleaming, feeling a little greasy with the oils, 3 women took over to towel dry my hair and brush it out. My hair dried quickly in the hot, arid air. I expected them to put it up in some elaborate style, but they parted it down the middle and left it down. I was given dancing silks to wear. They gave me white, with lots of silver decoration on the skimpy top and around my waist. Really, there wasn't much more than 2 triangular cups for my boobs, that barely contained my breasts, and a pair of long silk strips that did a very poor job of covering my lower regions, front and back. Then they put a pair of stiletto heels on my feet. They finished it off with lots of thin silver bangles on my wrists, a silver slave collar, and big silver hoop earrings. Colin attached a leash to my collar as an elfin slave girl dabbed perfume on strategic, and very intimate, places on my body. I have to admit, the whole process left me a little breathless and highly aroused. Come, Devesa, time for the king to enjoy his new elfin plaything, Colin said, sounding just a touch bitter. Did you have a woman before your capture and enslavement, Colin? I asked. Any children? No, he said. A bleak expression washed across his face. I was born and bred in captivity. My family has been slaves for 6 generations. We were owned by the human royal family before Folkshorde conquered them, and took possession of me and my family. I'm sorry, I said. Very disturbing. I knew humans kept slaves, even elfin slaves. Elves were the most expensive and coveted slaves, mostly due to our long lives. By human standards, we were practically immortal. Of all the peoples of the world, only elves didn't keep slaves. Perhaps we could help each other. Don't even talk about it, he said. Orcs are the most powerful masters, and no one ever escapes them, but... Who told you that? I asked, mildly amused. The orcs? He slanted an unreadable look at me. Did I put a seed of doubt in his head? Colin must have something in him to rise to be the king's slave master. From what little I've seen of him, Colin wasn't cruel or evil. The other slaves seemed to like and respect him. He noticed me speculating about him, so gave the leash a sharp yank. This conversation is over, he said. There is no escape. Your only concern is to make the king and his guests happy. Do what they want, and do it with a smile and enthusiasm. Don't worry about me, slave master, I said, making him cringe. I always please in bed, and I'm quite enthusiastic, too. You're not a virgin? Please. I'm elfin, not some human princess saving herself for marriage, I said. Do you know anything about your own people? No. Not really, he said. Just that elves despise those like me, who are bred slaves and who served orcs. We know our own kind would execute us for our weakness if we escaped to them. I just gawked at him. Who told them that? How come he couldn't see they were just lies to keep them in bondage? Before I could gather my thoughts, though, we arrived at a pair of ornate doors guarded by 2 Orcish warriors. One of the guards was pissing against the wall, just feet from the doors. The other was busy digging boogers out of his rather large nose, and then eating them. Neither looked particularly alert or competent. I am so out of here within the week. The elfin princess, Devessa, is ready for the king's pleasure, Colin said formally. Dinky thing, the booger-loving orc said, looking me over. Despite his disdain, his cock stiffened and tented his black pelt loincloth. Folks ready. Go in. Colin sighed, and then opened the door himself. I watched the 2 guards warily. The one never tucked his gigantic cock away, and it was dripping urine as he ogled me and played with it. The other orc returned to digging for boogers. I think I'm going to be sick, I muttered. The 2 orcs laughed. Colin grimaced, and led me through the door. Your Majesty, your elfin slave, Princess Devessa, is ready to submit, Colin said. I looked around. It was a bedchamber, but a huge one. The High Lady of the Emerald Forest's bedchamber wasn't a quarter the size of that room. The king's personal treasure was piled and strewn everywhere. There was no furniture I could see. My eyes quickly locked on the pelts and colorful blankets spread on the floor, about a foot high, where the bed should have been. Apparently, King Fulk still wasn't civilized enough for an actual bed. Said King was sprawled naked atop the pile. Holy oaks, I whispered, seeing his erection. For a second I couldn't breathe, or even think. That's going to hurt. So I'd been told, Colin whispered. Then loudly, Princess Devessa of the Emerald Forest, give your leash to King Fulk and submit. Colin handed me his end of the leash. It was nothing but a 5-foot-long silver chain, about as thick as my little finger, with a leather loop for the master to hold. I looked at it in my hand, and then looked at Fulk. The Orcish king was watching me with an evil grin. He started stroking himself. My body reacted in ways I found surprising. Though the idea of spreading my legs for an evil, murderous orc was repulsive, the sight of his huge body, covered in scars and tattoos, was oddly appealing. His cock, so long and thick, made my pussy throb, so hot and wet. I've never been with anyone with such a monster of a cock. I wasn't sure I could take him into me. I knew I was going to try my best to do just that. Your Majesty, I said, throat almost too tight to speak. I swallowed the lump as I started towards him. My insides turned all hot and mushy. The only sounds were my heels striking the stone floor and his heavy breathing. I dropped to my knees at the foot of his bed and dropped my gaze. Lifting the other end of the leash with both hands, I whispered, "Master, I am yours." My skin flashed hot and goosefleshed with those words. I couldn't breathe as he sat up and took the leash. Fulk pulled on the leash, forcing me to all fours. As he continued to pull, I crawled up on the bed. I fixated on his erection. "How may I please you, master?" I whispered. Yeah, that was a dumb question. I know. My brain wasn't functioning particularly well at the time. "You know what to do," Fulk said. I wrapped one, then the other hand around his dark gray shaft. Despite how rough and toad-like the skin appeared, it was hot, smooth, and bumpy in my hands. The cock's head was more arrow-shaped than an elfin or human cock, which was all I had experience with before then. I leaned forward, pressing my lips to the rubbery head, and gave him a kiss and lick. Pre-cum oozed out the tip, and I spread it all over his length with my hands. It got hotter and hotter in there, and became increasingly hard to breathe. "Oh my," I whispered, opened wide, and went down on him. I bobbed my head a few times, and then ran my tongue down his length on one side, and back up the other. I watched his face. Though it was hard to read orcs, Fulk looked pleased. So I continued to lick up and down and all around his erection, and then I kissed, nuzzled, and licked his hairy balls. He actually groaned when I gently scraped my teeth across the skin of his nutsack. "She's acceptable, slave master," Fulk finally said. "You may leave, Dot." "By your leave, your majesty," he replied, and back out of the chamber. I continued to suck on his cock, working my tongue. It wasn't easy. He was so thick he stretched my jaw to the limit. I tried harder to make him come, hoping to finish before he decided to throw me on my back and mount. "Elves suck better than anyone," Fulk said. He palmed my whole head and dragged me up his body, until I was straddling his waist. That monster cock lay on my back, feeling so hot and scary. Elves are all natural-born slaves of the orcs. Normally, I'd argue that point, I whispered, panting from my efforts, heart thundering in my ears. What do you want from me?" He yanked my top off. One hand held my head, keeping me in place, while his other hand fondled my tits. I couldn't believe how good it felt. Was my fear stimulating my libido? Or was it knowing that there was nothing I could do to save myself from a fierce and sound fucking? Whatever it was, my nipples were hard, erect, and super sensitive. My sex ached terribly, so hot and needy despite knowing his enormity would hurt so much. "Maybe I'll get a son off you first, and then ransom you back to your mother," he said. I didn't know what to say to that. Was my worst-case scenario about to be played out? But what was a year or two to me in the whole scheme of things? I could reasonably expect to live 5,000 years. An orc's maximum life expectancy was about 60 or 70 years. Few lived past their mid-20s due to their violent, warlike nature and lifestyle. There was no way I was staying long enough to conceive. Suddenly, a week within the king's tender mercy was too long. I was escaping at the first opportunity. Elfin warriors and nobles were all trained to escape captivity, though I never really thought I'd need that training. But first... I groaned, going down on him again. There was a certain satisfaction that came with getting it hard from a big cock. Fulk's cock might prove there was an upper limit to size, but I wanted to find out for myself. By the time I could take him to the back of my throat, Fulk became impatient or something. The Orc King lifted me up effortlessly, spun me around. I found myself on all fours, straddling him, and his face between my legs. Fulk's huge, terribly rough hands held onto my hips, while pulling my butt cheeks apart. He started licking. "Ooh," I sighed, my body trembling. That felt good. Maybe too good. His tongue was quite long and hot, and it felt amazing lathing the juices off my achy, needy pussy. And then he snaked that tongue past my sensitive folds, plowing into my sex. "Holy oak," I whispered, and then I went down on him again. I licked, sucked, and nibbled on his erection, while the king made my body sing. Before too long I felt the change inside, my belly turning into hot mush, and that divine tension starting to build. His powerful, thick tongue felt like a cock inside me. A very wiggly cock. Hell, I've been with men not that well endowed. Oh my. Oh. Oh. I gasped, struggling to continue sucking him off. His tongue was so distracting. I was so close. Oh, Your Majesty. Oh my. Yes. Yes. Just like. My body erupted with pure euphoric pleasure. Fulk pressed his face firmer against me, while I bucked and writhed. He ate me out all the way through my orgasm, making it stretch out forever. He left me a quivering mess sprawled atop his huge, sweaty body. I knew you were a little slut elf the moment I saw you, he said. I didn't care what he thought. Keeping my thoughts to myself, I forced myself back to all fours, and went down on him again. We weren't finished until he came. I knew the drill. Besides, I'd rather have his seed in my stomach than my womb. Even though I was months away from my next fertile period, it wasn't unheard of to be impregnated after a traumatic event. You're going to make a fun slave, Devessa, Fulk said. He pulled me off his cock, threw me on my back, and moved between my suddenly very widespread legs. Now it's my turn to have fun. I don't think it will fit. I fuck a dozen elfmaids a day, he said, rubbing his cock all over my pussy. I huffed and puffed, suddenly unable to get enough air. I felt so hot and sweaty, and trembled like a leaf. Desperate, I tried to think of anything to at least delay being taken by him. King Fulk was not to be denied. I cried upon penetration. Hurts. He stretched me to the max. With just the arrow-shaped head inside me, I felt at the limit my body could accommodate. For a second I thought he would kill me, but then my body started to relax around him. The Orc King was able to thrust a little deeper. And then deeper. Fulk pulled completely out, and then thrust into me twice as deep. I cried. Oh. Gentle. Please, I'll do anything, just be gentle. Funny elf, he said in that deep, booming voice. I swear, it was at least 2 octaves lower than before we started. This is as gentle as I get. I am king of the orcs. Begging for gentle proved a mistake. Fulk became more aggressive. He thrust harder, deeper. I bucked and writhed, clutching him in fear and desperation. By the time the huge orc was fully sheathed inside me, my legs were wrapped tightly around him. Was I trying to force him deeper? My hips thrust upward to meet him as he eagerly plowed into me. Yes. Yes. I cried. My body was singing. The most amazing sensations rippled through me with every thrust. I struggled to breathe, and my head felt like it was wrapped in wet cotton. My only thought was that cock. Yes. Fuck me. Fuck me. That wonderful rush to climax started. I felt hot tingles flow into my thighs. Digging my nails into his thick skin, I tightened my legs around him. And it hit me. My sex exploded, sending the most amazing waves of euphoric pleasure throughout my body. King Fulk laughed. The Orc King was tireless, if nothing else. He thrust into me like that until I came 3 more times, before he finally filled me with his potent seed. And after a short rest, he did it again. And again. It would prove to be the longest night of my life. Chapter 4. I looked around the throne room. It was long, narrow, and tall, with lots of windows that overlooked the city below. It wasn't my first visit to that esteemed chamber. When I was a child of just 35, I was part of an elfin delegation on the 50th anniversary of the old human king's coronation. The throne room was a lot cleaner back then, and the human courtiers were a lot less bestial looking than the current Orcish court. I glanced up into the rafters. Orcish battle trophies hung from them. I saw the old kingdom's flag, along with a dozen of their war banners. All were rotting and in tatters. The armor and weapons of other vanquished foes hung from the rafters, too. There were even weapons and war banners from Orcish hordes King Fulk fought and defeated. My captured weapons were up there, so close yet so far, taunting me. Worst of all were the rotting heads and skulls of defeated enemies, mostly Orcish foes of Fulk. A few looked pretty fresh, so you know it stank to the heavens and beyond. Oddly, none of the orcs seemed to notice or mind. King Fulk held court there every afternoon. For the past 10 days I have knelt or reclined at his feet, wearing nothing but skimpy dancing silks and chained by the neck to his throne. I, too, was a battle trophy. Fulk loved to put me on display. He paraded me through the streets on a leash whenever he went out into the city. Gnar, warlord of the Blood Horde, a booming voice called. I looked down the length of the throne room. About a third of the assembled orcs wore bright silk loincloths, if not robes. The rest were in their regular wide belt and leather loincloths. All were covered with their tribal tattoos, scarring, and piercings. They were Fulk's family and favorites. The newcomer was an especially large orc, maybe 8 feet tall. His loincloth was finely wrought gold chain mail, with an ornate silver belt. Gnar was trailed by a dozen of his warriors, all carrying gifts for Fulk. Fulk stood and stepped down off the dais, meeting Gnar face to face. Gnar gave a curt nod, and then slammed his fist into the middle of Fulk's chest. The king was forced back half a step. I shook my head. Orcish greetings were so barbaric. Welcome to my kingdom, Gnar, Fulk said, and pounded his fist in the middle of Gnar's chest. The visiting warlord dropped back 2 steps. You honor us with your visit. The courtiers were all smiling and nodding. Fulk proved himself stronger. Gnar didn't look happy, but said nothing as Fulk returned to his throne. I gave the warlord a challenging look when his gaze fell upon me. Gnar presented his gifts, which were obviously captured treasure. Mostly it was gold and silver coins, with a chest of gemstones and jewelry. There were bolts of silk and even a book. I doubted any of them could read, but they treated it reverently. A lot of the more barbaric peoples of the world thought anything written was magical. The Blood Horde notables moved to the side as the court prepared to greet the next group. I glanced at my sword, Fong, hanging in the rafters above the doors. I wondered if the orcs even realized it was enchanted. My leather and steel bracers were tied together and dangling from the same rafter, though my tattered and shredded clothes were draped over another, much closer to the dais. If it wasn't for the enchanted nose stud suppressing my magic, I could have my weapons and be gone in a flash. Sometimes magic is your friend, sometimes, not so much. A commotion outside the door drew my eyes, as well as many others. Courtiers began talking amongst themselves more and more as we waited. Finally, a lone Orcish warrior strode in and straight up to the throne room. Everyone's attention locked on him. King Fulk, he shouted, holding a fist-sized red gemstone. Well, my fist-sized. It was tiny in his hand. This was sent by the court of the Emerald Forest. The border guards were told it is the High Lady's answer to your demand for ransom. I got a thrill. My skin goosefleshed and I sighed softly. My freedom was at hand. That's all she's willing to pay for her own daughter? Fulk said, and turned vicious eyes on me. I thought you said they'd pay a lot. My thrill turned into a chill. That's not the ransom, I said. It's a messenger stone. What is that? I did a double take. You don't, never mind. I sighed, shaking my head. Such barbarians. My lord, it is a common means for rulers to speak to one another. The High Lady has another just like this one, and when either of you activates theirs, it sends a signal to the other. You can then speak to each other live, just like you were in the same room. He said nothing for a long time. I could see the suspicion in his eyes. The entire court stirred uneasily. Barbarians feared and distrusted anything magical. If he refused to use it, then it could take months to conduct the ransom negotiations via messengers. How do I activate it? Fulk asked, leaning forward. Such a sense of relief flowed through me. My insides became all tingly. It's easy. I'll show you, if you're ready to speak to the High Lady right now. Do it. I turned to the warrior. Place the stone on the floor and back away. He did as told and backed away with his hand on his hilt. I waited until he was next to the door, and then I spoke loudly. Just about everyone in the throne room put hand to hilt. Speak. The stone started to glow. It was a dull glow for a few seconds, and then started to brighten. Why isn't it working? King Fulk said. It's working, I said. See how it's glowing brighter? That means the High Lady has been summoned and is walking towards it. When she arrives. That's all I had time for. The stone flashed, and my mother, the High Lady of the Emerald Forest, appeared to leap out of the stone. My breath caught. She was so beautiful and majestic. Maeve looked so serene, yet powerful. Halt! I cried, when almost everyone pulled a weapon. King Fulk was on his feet, a great warhammer held in both hands. His thick muscles rippled under his rough skin. He looked like barely contained violence. Mother, I said, bowing my head. I was on my knees, so couldn't really bow properly. Her eyes turned to me. For the briefest second, I saw all of her pain and misery. Then her head of state persona took over. Duvessa, her rich voice said. Have they treated you well? They are not, torturing me, if that is what you mean, but I'm eager to come home. I saw her lips tighten just a smidge. Her eyes looked me over, taking in the skimpy, translucent purple dancing silks that hid nothing. Her eyes narrowed as she turned her regard to King Fulk and looked him over. Damned elfin magic, King Fulk snarled. I don't like it. No doubt, Maeve said. Shall we get down to business? King Fulk growled, still in a fighting stance. Everyone in the throne room had their hands on their weapons, if not already drawn and presented. I shook my head, noticing my mother glance my way. It was too bizarre. Why get so worked up over a magical projection? It's not like she can cast a spell through her projection. She is absolutely no threat to anyone there. Orcs started creeping in on her. I saw one with ropes. Another had a net. Really? Mother, I don't think they understand, I started saying. Stop, Dot. An Orcish warrior cried out and charged her, swinging his battle axe to decapitate. She ducked, because if it actually hit her the spell would collapse. The backblast of such a powerful spell would be quite painful for her. Fulk barked a vicious laugh and leapt upon her, brining his great warhammer down on her head. My mother threw up her arms instinctively, and she popped out of existence the second his iron hammer connected to her projection. Boom! A-A-A-I-I-E. I cried, hit by the magical blast. It was like a punch in the nose. My head spun, and I found myself on my back. My nose ached like crazy. When I looked up, blinking away tears, I spotted my sword in bracers swaying. None of the orcs seemed the least bit affected. Only magical persons and items. What happened? King Fulk demanded. Where is the elf witch? Oh, I groaned, rubbing my sore nose. There was a trickle of blood across my upper lip. I rubbed the blood between my fingers, heart hammering. I touched the talisman and it didn't strike me down. Glancing at the now shattered messenger stone, I fought to keep a smile off my face. Why did you do that? She is my enemy and must be destroyed, Fulk growled, glaring murderously at me. Is she dead? Dead? Don't be, I said, and paused to gather my thoughts. That backblast messed up my head, too. The orcs were lucky they weren't the least bit magical. That was not really the High Lady, Your Majesty. That was just a projection of her. She never left the Emerald Forest. All you did was destroy the best means to communicate and negotiate. I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of knowing it probably hurt her terribly. My poor mother might be sprawled out unconscious as we spoke. Since it was her spell, then she would suffer the brunt of the mystic blast. I had a bad feeling she wouldn't send another messenger stone. I glanced up at Fong. My sword still swung from the rafters. It was an extremely powerful talisman, so I doubt it was destroyed by the backblast. I got a thrill. Soon it would be in my hand, and those enchanted bracers would be around my forearms. I was going home. Chapter 5. My eyes popped open. Fulk snored next to me. As usual, I was curled up to his right, while he lay sprawled in the middle of the bed. Slowly turning my head, I looked behind me to judge how deeply he slept. Fulk was a light sleeper. Rising up on an elbow, I looked around for a knife, sword, or axe. If I could kill the Orcish bastard, I would. Unfortunately, he wasn't as ignorant as I liked to think. There were no weapons in that chamber. I eased up to all fours. "What are you doing?" Fulk demanded, his huge hand wrapping around my thigh. Yeah, his hand was that big. It was kind of sick, but every time he laid hands on me my body got all hot and tingly. Butterflies erupted in my belly, and I felt my pussy getting hotter and slicker. Honestly, though, that big monster could shake my world. "My bladder is full," I replied. Glancing at his cock, I saw it starting to rise. "I have to go or I'll burst." My mouth watered and my body ached. I sucked in a deep breath, desperate to cool my surging needs and desires. You know, I hated how easily he excited my body and libido. Of course, angry sex was the best, and Fulk was a very angry orc. After the debacle with my mother and the messenger stone, the king took me while I was still chained to his throne. Right in front of his entire court and guests, Fulk fucked me stupid. I swear, he had me in every orifice of my body, 3 times. He didn't stop until I passed out. Yeah, it was terribly glorious. Memories of all the times he'd taken me in the last 10 days and nights flooded into my head, unbidden. The brutal bastard had me every way a man could take a woman, and I think he came up with a few more. Back against the wall, face against the wall, hanging upside down by my widespread ankles. Ooh, I sighed, now fully aroused and so horny it hurt. Pre-cum really started coming out. Fulk squirmed, buried his humongous fingers deep in my long hair, and I groaned with pleasure. Hands in my hair was always such a turn on. "Don't dally," he said, releasing my leg and hair. The king grabbed his cock, which started to grow in his hand. He was going to have his way when I returned. Like usual. Damned light sleeper. I'm waiting. Big problem. Fulk was fully awake. He would wait for my return, and he wasn't patient. If I took too long, he would come after me and drag me back to his bed by my hair. He's done it many times during my captivity. The thought took my breath away and made my pussy throb. "Yes, sire," I murmured. Of course, there was one way to ensure he fell asleep fast. "Holy oak, I hate how much you make me crazy," I murmured, as I wrapped a hand around his fat cock. Pre-cum beat it on the tip, so I leaned over him and plucked it off with the tip of my tongue. Master." I felt his cock swell a bit. He loved it when I said things like that. "You own me." He growled low in the throat. "My body is just candy for your big cock." My insides quickly turned into a hot, mushy mess. I might have wanted it more than him. Mother always said my libido would be my undoing. "MMGH," I moaned, starting to lick his cock up and down and all around. There was a lot to lick. His butt lifted off the bed when I dragged my long nails across his hairy nutsack. So I did it again, digging in a little more. I caught his eyes, wagged my brows, and grinned with wickedness. It's going to hurt so good when you plow into me. No lie. Really, I loved it way too much. Crawling up his body, kissing, licking, nibbling as I went, I felt his erection trace a wet line down my neck, between my boobs, and then down my belly. I didn't stop until that cock slipped over my achy pussy and pressed into my butt crack. Holding his gaze, feeling it intensely, I lifted my butt until I was above his cock. Guiding him in, I impaled myself. Ooh, yes, I sighed. He never failed to stretch me out to the max. It was such an incredible feeling, too. As much as I hated to admit it, I might actually miss it after I'm gone. Folk's hands went straight to my jostling tits. Though I think he loved my long, black hair the most, it was my tits he enjoyed playing with more than anything else. My nipples were already hard and erect, making him want to pinch, pull, and roll them. It felt so amazing, and soon he was sending incredible sensations rippling through my body. Holding onto his monstrously broad, thick shoulders, I started to ride him as hard and fast as I could. I thrust my hips, forcing myself up and down his shaft faster and faster. There was nothing easy about it, since he was so big and it was so hard to concentrate. Yet, I was determined to make him come as fast as possible. The son I get off you will be prettier than jars, Fulk said. I said nothing. First of all, his son was one but ugly bastard. Any baby had to be prettier than him. But, I was not going to be around long enough to be quickened by him. I hoped. The longer it lasted, the harder it became. I panted furiously, feeling sweat prickling my skin. All those wonderful sensations flowing through me didn't help. I just wanted to bask in the glory of it all. I started to hope he would roll me over and take over. Faster, he said. He fully sheathed inside me with every thrust. I was doing my best to slide up and down his full length, too. Just the way Fulk liked it. And, well, it was better for me, too. Holy oak! I cried. I'm trying. He was so damned demanding. Fulk pushed me to the limit every time. Oh, I sighed, slowing down when I felt hot tingles flow through me, filling my things. The rush to climax began, even as I started losing control. Oh, yes. Yes. Stupid elf, he growled. The Orc King grabbed my butt with both hands and slammed me up and down his cock. Faster and faster. Relentlessly. My body started shaking. My head spun, before my mind became too sluggish to think. All I knew was pure, unadulterated pleasure as I rose closer and closer to ultimate release. Yes. I cried with every deep thrust. Yes. 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 Intense euphoria erupted deep within. My very core throbbed with orgasmic intensity. I thought my whole body would explode. And then I felt the king stiffen and flood my vagina with seed. And my body climaxed again. Oh yes. Collapsing with exhaustion atop him, I lay there huffing and puffing. I felt such contentment and accomplishment. At moments like that, I thought he was the greatest lover ever. But he always reminded me what a prick he was pretty quickly. King Fulk seized me around the waist and lifted me off of his cock. Let me tell you, it felt as amazing coming out as it did going in. Talk about energize my libido again. Problem was, he tossed me to the side like trash. My face heated up, but I managed to hold my tongue. I lay there curled up a long moment. So tired and winded. I sucked in air as fast as possible, but it never seemed enough. Hurry up, Fulk said, his voice an octave lower. A thrill raced up my spine. He wanted me again when I returned. I could tell by the timbre of his voice. Clean up and get back in here. MMMK, I murmured, head spinning, and body tingling and quivering so sweetly. Slipping out of the bed of pelts, I slowly walked to the huge double doors on wobbly legs. I had trouble walking a straight line, and the Orc King barked a laugh. Yeah, he messed me up, but I usually recovered quickly from our trysts. Folk stood up next to his bed and urinated on the wall. So disgusting. The chamber pot wasn't in his bedchamber. It was kept in a small chamber down the corridor. I think his lovers were the only ones in the castle who used it. Folk didn't mind if anyone pissed on his wall, but he wouldn't tolerate feces or women emptying themselves of his copious amounts of cum in his bedchamber. He was back in bed before I reached the door. The bedchamber was that big, and I was walking that slowly. I was naked as the day I was born. There were dancing silks on the floor by the bed, but folk would get suspicious if I put them on. And honestly, after my short time with the orcs, I was kind of getting used to being naked. But I couldn't escape into the desert naked. The sun would bake me alive. I was assaulted by loud snorts before I reached the door. Pausing to glance back, I smiled. That was exactly what I'd hoped would happen. He would wake up again upon my return, but I didn't plan on returning. He's going to be so crazy mad when he figures out I escaped. I touched my index finger to the silver nose stud. Nothing happened and I got all tingly happy inside. I closed my eyes and concentrated, centering myself, and felt my magic stir. His ignorance and fear of magic freed me from his talisman, and he wasn't able to figure it out in time. I kind of felt proud of myself, though I knew it was his stupidity that set me free. Goodbye and good riddance, I whispered. Easing the heavy door open, I heard Fulk's snoring falter. He glanced at me, and went back to sleep. I slipped out, and eased it closed. The opening door might have awakened the king for a second, but his guards continued to snore away. Figures. The two Orcish guards being asleep wasn't a surprise. Half of the time they were when I went to use the chamber pot. So I hurried to the small room where it was kept, because I really did need to empty my bladder and clean up after my tryst with Fulk. My body slowly cooled and calmed. By the time I was clean and relieved, I felt myself again. It was really quite thrilling to be escaping. The orcs swore no one could escape them. I was going to prove them wrong. Maybe my escape would inspire others to try. That thought didn't cheer me in the least. I was leaving. The other slaves would remain, too afraid and cowed to do a damn thing to save themselves. It felt like I was abandoning them. All I could think about was how sad Colin seemed when he spoke of the uselessness of escape. They had him convinced he'd just be killed by his own kind if he escaped. I can't save them all, I whispered, feeling like a monster despite knowing it was true. I was sneaking through the dark, empty corridors. It was astonishing how cold it got in the desert at night. But as I grew closer to the throne room and my weapons, my mind became more troubled. I was not raised to run from a fight. Leaving one of my own kind to the mercy of our enemies was against all I knew and stood for. Honor demanded action. But what could I do? All of the elfin slaves I'd encountered during my captivity looked at me with wonder and awe. I was a princess in their eyes, ignoring the fact that was a human title and concept. They all expressed how much they prayed I'd be ransomed and go home as soon as possible. I think they were more distressed by my captivity than I was. Their eyes always glazed over, and they could only whisper the word freedom when they spoke to me. Never their freedom. Just my freedom. My throat tightened. My eyes burned. I was so pissed. At them. At myself. Holy Oak, save me, I muttered, brushing my eyes. I can't leave them behind. Staying was not an option. The orcs would never ransom them all back to the Emerald Forest. The High Lady would pay ransom for them, as well, but if that was an option the orcs would have already approached us about it. And after what happened with the Messenger Stone, I wasn't sure King Fulk would ransom me back at all. Reaching the throne room, I was only mildly surprised it wasn't guarded. It was really hard to believe no one had ever escaped Orcish captivity. As far as I knew, the orcs only used talismans on magically talented captives and slaves. Were the city walls guarded better than the king's castle? I'm going to find out tonight, I whispered, slipping through the open throne room doors. There was no light in there. I barely made out my sword and bracers in the rafters. So centering myself, I called up my magic. Then I willed myself up to Fawn in the bracers. Gathering them up, I allowed my body to sink back to the floor. Felt good to use magic again. I belted the sword on, and then put on the enchanted bracers. The sword, Fawn, was created to fight supernatural threats, like werewolves and vampires, but its enchantment kept the edge keen and ensured it never broke in battle. The bracers were created by my mother, so were called Maid's bracers. They looked like iron, but were enchanted silver, and the magic gave my arms more strength and punching power. I look stupid, I muttered, scowling around the vast chamber. I'd never seen a single article of clothing not on an orc or slave since my arrival. From what I could determine, no one owned any clothes other than what they wore every day. Basically just one loincloth. That included the king. I'd settle for a loincloth right now. I moved over to a window overlooking the city. The castle sat upon the highest point in the city, and the throne room overlooked the eastern side of Al Shardin. The slave quarters were on the western side of the city, so I couldn't see it. Still, there were no lights or movement below me. The city looked dead, deserted at night. In contrast, an elfin city was alit all night with colored lanterns hanging from the eaves and limbs of the elfin oaks. It was a beautiful sight to behold, and the thought really made me homesick. Now I just had to get out of the castle, make it to the slave quarters, and convince them to follow me to freedom. All without being seen or caught by an Orcish patrol. How hard could that be? After I got out, I had to find all of the horses they haven't eaten yet. Orcs didn't ride, they ate horses. So on horseback we'd be uncatchable. Problem was, I doubted there were enough horses for everyone, even doubling up. First things first, then I'll worry about patrols and horses and other problems, I whispered as I studied the window. I was quite impressed when I first saw the glass windows. I'd never have believed it if someone told me the orcs had plate glass anywhere in their kingdom. Maybe they had some slaves who knew how to create it. There was some trade between the orcs and other races, but they were mostly interested in weapons or at least metal, and cattle. The throne room windows weren't designed to open. Shame, because I could just jump out the window and float down to the street. That chamber had the only real windows I'd seen in the castle, and the arrow slits were all too narrow for me to slip through. Now I'd have to get out of the castle the hard way. Thinking about escape gave me a thrill. I got all tingly inside. So exciting. Maybe Mother was right? Maybe I am a thrill seeker? With a big sigh, I turned back to the door. There was a giant shape standing there, filling the doorway. "Who's there?" a deep Orcish voice called. I froze. Oh. Chapter 6. The elf princess is trying to escape, he shouted, even as he smacked a brass-studded mace into his palm. He was backlit, so I couldn't make out his face. His posture was that of confidence. There was no way he was worried about a puny elf made 1/3 his size. Please, don't make him laugh. I pulled Fawn, eager to make him squeal like a little girl. I knew how to do it, too. And now I was pissed because he ruined a perfect escape. The last thing I needed was more complications. "I'm going to cut off your dick and shove it up your ass," I growled as menacing as possible. He stiffened, but I doubt it was from fear. Men, whether elf, human, or orc, were very defensive of their genitalia. Any insult or threat aimed at said cock and balls upset them. Made them mad. Hopefully, my threat made that orc angry and a bit more reckless. More shouts, sounding the alarm, answered his warning. Now I was really in trouble. Of course, that's when the orc shouted a battle cry and charged me. I dropped into a defensive stance, sword ready. My mind was running through different scenarios. Even with Fong and the bracers, I wasn't stupid enough to think I was a match for him. At some point, size does trump skill, and the castle guards were the Orcish elite warriors. Just before he reached me, I willed myself straight up as fast as I could. The orc grunted, stumbled, and crashed through the window. To his credit, the orc never cried out in fear while plummeting to his death. I was impressed. I'd have screamed like a little girl. Dropping back to the floor, I headed for the door. I didn't have a choice now. I'd have to fight my way out of the castle. Well, I'd have to avoid fighting as much as possible, while working my way towards the entrance. But I was brought up short by the arrival of 3 more Orcish guards. "The elf is armed," one of them called. "I know," I cried. "Scary, aren't I?" "Elf, we're going to." I interrupted him. "Where's the first guard?" "Oopsie. Did I already dispatch him?" That made them stop and look around. Bet that hurt their thick skull to figure out. I screamed, charging forward 3 steps. The orcs jumped back and dropped into defensive stances. I turned around and raced to the shattered window. Before they understood what I planned, I launched myself through the window. Plummeting down, I quickly called up my magic and slowed my descent. It took a few more heartbeats than was comforting, but I slowed my fall enough to survive the landing. I was forced to one knee and a 3-point stand. Ouch. That hurt, I muttered, as I glanced to my left. The dead guard was sprawled spread eagle. I spotted his mace, sheathed Fung, and picked it up. The more weapons the better. Sorry, but better you than me. The castle's alarm bell rang out. Until that moment, I didn't even know they had a bell. Talk about waking the dead. It echoed through the streets. They had to be waking up every orc in the city. Dashing into a dark alley, I quickly made my way northeast. I had to get to the wall as quickly as possible. On the next street over, I took off running. One of the great things about being an elf was the ability to run like the wind for a pretty long time. The city streets were built by humans. So that street twisted and turned all over the place. I had to leave it, turning down another street heading northeast. In fact, I had to turn onto new streets many times before reaching the wall. I swear, humans aren't capable of drawing a straight line, I grumbled. Orcs were slowly leaving the houses to answer the call to arms. The best I could tell, they only knew there was a problem. No one bothered to look around for me when they entered the street, so I had to assume there weren't different rings or bells for different issues. But I did have to be alert to avoid being seen, while continuing as fast as possible to the city walls. There was no moon that night. The darkness was my friend. Still, I could count 2 orcs on the city wall's catwalk, one on each side of the decades-old breach. After a moment, I caught movement down by the rubble. Another guard stood facing away from the ruined wall. They all looked alert. The bell was still ringing. It probably won't stop until after they've killed or captured me, or my escape was confirmed. How do I make them think I escaped through that breach, Edot? I always have lots of ideas. Few are ever feasible, but it would be epic if I could pull them off. After a moment of squatting just inside a dark alley, I figured out my best option. It at least had a tiny chance of success. Retracing my steps back up the alley, I moved over a ways and returned to the outer walls down a small street. There was no one in sight, so I rushed up to the wall and used my magic to fly atop the catwalk. Then I turned towards and charged the orc by the breach. I was stealthy enough that he didn't spot me until too late. Die, orcs! I cried, and whacked him in the belly with the mace. Oof, he cried, doubled up around the mace, and then fell off the wall. Lost my mace, but that didn't stop me. I pulled Fong and used my magic to leap across the breach. The orc over there didn't expect that, so I came down on him with a single flash of my blade. He lost his left shoulder and arm, and I suspect he was dead before he hit the ground. Tell King Fulk that Devessa, daughter of Maeve, claims the honor of being the first to ever escape. With that, I jumped through the breach and outside of the city. I heard the orc warrior bellow with rage, followed by the sound of scuffing feet and tumbling rocks as he climbed through the rubble to get to me. I didn't wait for him. "Breach 5, he shouted. "Escape through breach 5. I got all tingly hearing that, and how others down the wall relayed the message. Soon, Fulk would lead his warriors after me through that breach. Running down to where I first jumped upon the wall, I willed myself up and over to the street beyond. When there was no new call of alarm, I smiled. I did it. Now they thought I was outside of the city escaping. I couldn't move as quickly as before. There were a lot orcs out in the streets. All were males, heading for the castle. So I used my magic to gain the roof of a mud brick home, and then went by rooftop. The streets were so narrow, I rarely had to use my magic to leap across. I then looped around south of the castle, knowing they'd all soon be heading northward. I did pass by close enough to hear their angry mockshouts and cries. Yeah, they sounded really pissed. I grinned and continued working my way towards the slave quarters. I suspected the orcs locked the slaves in and doubled the guard. They wouldn't worry about me, but it was the perfect time for the other slaves to revolt. If only they would. And there she is, I muttered, perched atop a nearby 2-story mud brick house. Just as I expected. Orcs were pretty contemptuous of slaves. They thought anyone who allowed themselves to be captured was weak, but to accept slavery over death just meant you were pathetic. At most they had 2 guards on the slave quarters at any given time. Granted, it was one of the few stone buildings in the city, with all of the windows bricked closed. There was only one way in or out, and every orc was more than a match for any man or elf. They did increase the guards. There were more than I expected. 5 all totaled, and they looked angry. Not alert, angry. I suspect there was little honor or glory guarding puny slaves when there was fighting to do. Or in this case, the honor of capturing the escaped Elfmaid. What can I say? Everyone, elf, human, and orc wanted to catch me, I thought. The elves and humans want to do far more pleasant things with me. I was pretty sure that if caught, my severed head would decorate King Fulk's throne room. Adorning his hall was not my idea of a good way to meet my fate. I burnt my bridges, and the bed on the other side. Dropping to the dirt street, I hurried to the back of the slave quarters. The back wall was the only one I'd never actually seen, so I wanted to ensure there wasn't a door or window I could exploit. There wasn't. So I lifted up to the flat roof and looked for a hatch. Most buildings with flat roofs had access. It did, but that too was sealed closed. No wonder it stinks in there, I said as I headed to the front. Looking over, I watched the 5 guards a long moment. Time to ruin their night. I wished I still had the mace. I would have liked 10 heartbeats to take out all 5, before I lost the element of surprise and the orcs still standing pulverized me into a bloody mush. Despite that, excitement bubbled within. Such dangerous moments were few and far between. Easing Fong out of the sheath, I perched at the very edge of the roof. Centering myself, I said a little prayer. This wasn't something I ever trained to do. Yet, I had 90 years of martial arts training, with emphasis on swords, knives, and hand-to-hand. This would be my greatest test. I slipped over the side and plunged straight down. I only used my magic to slow my fall enough to survive. Holding my sword over my head as I dropped, I brought its magically keen edge down upon the head of an Orcish guard. The strike was true, and I sliced him clean in half, head to crotch. The resistance of his body on the blade slowed me a bit more. Die! I screamed. The sword's enchantment made it slice through flesh and bone more easily than a normal blade, plus my enchanted bracers increased my arm strength to orcish levels. But I still was outnumbered 4-1. Lashing out with a foot, I snapped another orc's knee. At the same time I hacked off another guard's leg above the knee, and then spun to thrust my blade into a fourth orcish warrior's lower belly. "Yuck," he grunted, doubling over. I sensed the fifth and last orc's attack. Ducking under the gut-stuck orc, I spun around him as he brought a battle axe down on his wounded comrade. "Missed me, you moron," I taunted and slashed his left leg. I tried to stab him, but he jumped back. "Are you running from a delicate little thing like me? I'll kill you." I willed myself straight up and over him. He stumbled in his attack, desperate to spin around before I got under his guard. The bastard managed to backhand me as I moved in, spinning me completely around. Black and white flashed behind my eyes. That hit hurt all the way down into my legs. I threw myself onto my back, and his wild axe swing passed over me. Rolling back, I thrust both feet straight up between his legs. He grunted, froze, and puked. I was already on the move, and thrust Fong to the hilt between his ribs, right under his left armpit. Sword through the heart even stopped monster-sized orcs. The enchantment on the blade allowed me to pull it out effortlessly. With a spell, all the blood on the sword flowed off and onto the ground. I took a moment to deliver mercy strokes to the dying orcs, including the one with a broken leg. Any living orc was a threat. I grimaced as I looked around at all of the blood. It was shiny wet, and black in the dim starlight. Blood was splashed all over my body. In the heat of battle I never noticed it. That discovery kind of sickened my stomach. At least none of it was mine. The door was barred closed from the outside. The wooden bar weighed more than me, but I managed to lift it off and toss the heavy beam across the street. Maeve's bracers really gave me a lot of strength. I loved them. Stepping through the door, I paused and looked around. Everyone was awake and staring at me. Their eyes were huge. Guess they never saw a naked battle elf before. There wasn't as many as I thought. Maybe 300 mostly human men, with most of the elves being women. And there was maybe 24 goblins scattered amongst them. "If you're not doing anything better, why don't you come with me?" I asked. "I'm going home." They collectively gasped. I saw fear, dread, but only a few looked excited. "Are you crazy?" Colin cried, moving to the front of the group. He looked me up and down, twice, eyes huge and a little wild. "They'll kill us. When you escape, they'll kill every 10th slave." I did cringe. No one told me that. "Well, it's a good thing I came back for you," I said. "We'll all escape together." "They will kill us," a human woman shouted, looking to be consumed with dread. I almost said, "Better dead than a slave." They would probably not agree. Insulting them wouldn't help. "No, I'll lead you to safety," I said. "And freedom. Don't you want to be free?" "What about goblins?" a voice called. A scrawny-looking goblin stepped out of the crowd. "Are we invited to this escape?" "Of course," I said. "Everyone deserves to be free." "Then my sword arm, my life, is yours," he said. "And a mighty arm it is," I said. "Thank you. To escape with you is still death," an Elfmaid said. "Our people will kill us for our weakness and for serving the orcs. Obviously born into slavery, otherwise she'd know better. Unless the orcs really were that good at brainwashing them." I doubted the latter. "That's an orcish lie to keep you from even trying to escape," I said. "Why would I lead you to death? Come with me. On my honor, I swear the Emerald Forest will celebrate your escape and freedom. To stay is death." "To go is death," Colin said, sounding so miserable. But then his voice strengthened. He looked me dead in the eyes. Tears rolled down his cheeks. "I've groveled my whole life. No more. I'd rather die fighting for freedom. I swear my life to you, Devesa, Princess of the Elves. I lifted fawn high, freedom. Chapter 7. I've never been so proud of any group before. I could see the fear and uncertainty in their eyes, their posture, and their movements, but they were going to follow me. They were going to risk their lives for a chance to be free. Now it was my job to ensure they survived the ordeal. Before we leave, do you know where there are any water skins? I asked. We need to take as much water as we can. Food, too, but we can survive longer without food than we can without water. I'll take care of it, Colin said, waving some of the others over to him. Also, gather up as many torches as you can. I grinned at his questioning look. We're going to burn this city down when we escape. They will have to fight those fires, which will leave fewer to pursue us. Yes, several of the slaves cried. That's much easier than food and water, Colin said. We make torches and fill oil lamps in the building next door. So burning this city down won't be hard. He immediately tasked a dozen men and women to go over and start lighting and handing out torches. I silently vowed to convince my mother to hire him once back in the Emerald Forest. His resourcefulness and can-do attitude were priceless. I knew I could count on you, Colin, I replied. Now, what about horses? He paused and looked off into space a second. The goblin who spoke earlier started towards me, a look of eagerness in his face. The orcs have some, but not many. Why? Colin asked. If we can mount some warriors on horses, we can defend the main group better, I replied. If nothing else, it'll give us more options. Also, donkey, mules, and other draft animals can carry more water. I work in the corral, the goblin said. I can get the horses and donkeys. That surprised me. I've never seen or even heard of a goblin riding a horse. But then, maybe that was why the orcs put him in the corral. Are there many? I asked. He shrugged. Many hands of horses, not so many of the donkeys. Great. He couldn't count. Many hands could be 10. It could be 1,000. Your name? I offered my hand. He looked surprised, and then took it. A handshake was an important thing among most peoples. I wasn't real sure how significant it was among the goblins, but Hawk took my hand solemnly. I am Hawk, he said. He gave my hand a firm shake. We are one. I wasn't 100% sure if he saw us as equal partners, or if I just married him. Either way, I needed his loyalty and help. Hopefully I wouldn't have to live in the Dragon Reach Mountains and have his babies. Thanks, Hawk, I said. Did the orcs keep the horses' tack? No. They take away all leather to use elsewhere, he said. But I can make some rope bridles and reins. So you know how to ride? I know how, but I don't, he said. Horses and goblins do not live well together. As I thought. Word was, goblins and orcs saw horses only as food. Take as many men as you need, I said. Bring the horses and donkeys here as quickly as possible. What about the orcs? Colin said. He indicated the ringing bell. You've stirred them up like an ant bed. The thought did amuse me. Causing them distress was near and dear to my heart, but I knew they were really just angry. Orcs tended to be angry most of the time. Personally, I think they only knew calm and angry. No other emotional state. They're all over at the castle, I replied. At least I prayed they were all over there. It would get interesting quickly if they weren't. Before coming here, I made them think I escaped over the wall in the northeast. I looked at Hawk. But be careful. There could be stragglers. Hawk gathered all of the goblins together, another dozen human men, and then they hurried out of the door. The others were already collecting food and water. Colin divided the duties up, with the women carrying food and the men water. Colin, one other thing, I said. Do you know where we can get any weapons? I had no hope there were any weapons, captured or otherwise, accessible to us. But if anyone knew, it would be the slave master. Yes. I do, he said. I think my jaw dropped. Colin grinned at me, looking rather proud of himself. Princess, before you run off, a small, slim human woman said. She moved towards me like I might strike her. I lifted a brow, wondering what she could want of me. Then she lifted a light brown tunic, folded in her hands. I'm sure you'd like something to wear. I don't know, Colin said. Seeing you all naked and bloody might impress the orcs. Some of them still run into battle naked to prove their bravery. Thank you, I replied, accepting the tunic gratefully. I have nothing to prove in that respect. The tunic was too large, so fell to below my knees. That was fine. The sword belt cinched it around my waist nicely. Since I planned to ride a horse, I sliced it front and back so the hemline wouldn't rise inappropriately high when I straddled my mount. Time moved quickly as we filled waterskins from the well centered in the plaza the slave quarters bordered. Everyone was outside, loaded up with waterskins or packs of food strapped to their backs by the time the horses and donkeys arrived. Countless torches lit up the plaza. Great job, Hawk, I said, though disappointed to see only 20 horses and 9 donkeys. Who here has experience fighting from a horse? Only 10 humans and 2 elves raised their hands. Each was given a horse. Then I picked out 7 people who knew how to ride, and knew how to use a bow. Counting myself, that gave us 20 horse soldiers. Colin was not one of them. You are in charge of everyone on foot, Colin, I said. After we are all armed, I want you to lead them as quickly and quietly as possible to the breach just south of the western gate. I'll take the horsemen and try to keep the orcs that pursue at bay. I don't know where to go, he said. Due west, my friend. Due west is freedom, I said. A great, deep shout went up over at the castle. The escapees all gasped, eyes huge. We didn't know if that meant they knew what we were up to or not, but it put fire under my feet. I led the group out, heading towards the building Colin claimed orcs kept captured weapons before melting them down into more appropriate weapons for themselves. We set fires to every building, along several streets, as we went. If the orcs didn't know we were escaping before, it wouldn't be long before they knew something was amiss. The fires were really building, consuming all that brittle, dry wood. The captured weapons warehouse proved to be a mud brick structure with no roof. The door was solid, and took a few minutes to break apart. Unfortunately, there weren't many steel weapons. There were a few sabers I doled out to the horsemen. But there were lots of bows, quivers of arrows, and spears for the rank and file. Spears were mostly given to men, while the women got the bows. All of the horsemen received a spear and bow, with extra quivers of arrows tied together and draped over their mounts. Will the Maron and the elves help us? An elderly human man asked. I glanced off into the night sky. It was quite dark to the west, even though it was starting to get a little light in the east. It was closer to sunrise than I thought. Not good. Not until we reached the border to the kingdom of Mayer, I said. They won't know we're escaping until then. Don't you know magic? Colin asked. Can't you call them or something? I wish, I said, but it made me think. I could speak telepathically with my mother, if we were close and both of us were concentrating. Well, I had to concentrate. The High Lady could converse like that with barely a thought. If I survived, then I really needed to work on that aspect of my magic. But still. Maybe it's worth a try, but I'm very young and not very good with magic. You can contact them? I am going to try and contact my mother, and she can tell the Maron to come help us, I said. Everyone perked up. I didn't mean to give them such hope. Honestly, I doubt I can do it, but I'll try. Be quiet, everyone. Let her concentrate, Colin commanded. I stared at him, then at the expectant faces of hundreds of trusting people. I've never felt so inadequate in my life. Disappointing them would hurt so much, but I was committed to trying. Closing my eyes, I breathed deeply and centered myself. Gathering up all my scant magic, I concentrated on the spell of communication. Mother! Mother, please listen and take heed. We are escaping. We are weak and need help. Send. Someone screamed. Orcs. 5 orcs plowed into the escaping slaves. For a second the slaves froze, and I thought they would break, but then a great cry of rage went up. They surged at the orcs, swarmed over them, and killed them. It wasn't quick. It wasn't pretty. But they got the job done. I muttered a quick spell to amplify my voice. Run for your lives. Freedom is yours. Run. 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 Chapter 8. Riders. I called as I leapt upon my mount. The dun-colored mare snorted and reared before I gained full control of her. I lifted my bow. We take the fight to the orcs. We have to slow them down until everyone else is out of the city. Kill the orcs. Garth cried. He was a middle-aged human captured in battle 20 years back. He looked wasted away, and I wasn't sure there was much strength left in this scrawny body, but his face was lit with battle lust and deepest, darkest vengeance. All my riders looked eager to join battle. Gave me a chill. Follow me, I cried, and kicked my horse forward. Victory and freedom are ours. We didn't have to ride far to find orcs. Orcish warriors charged down the narrow, twisting streets. We stopped at intersections and decimated them with arrows. The slaughter was appalling. The orcs had no shields or armor, and nothing to hide behind. Soon there were piles of the dead and dying, acting like dams. Still, they fearlessly climbed over their dead, eager to get to us. Despite our best efforts, the Orcish horde was getting closer and closer. Fall back to the next intersections. But first, we hurled torches into the surrounding buildings. Let them burn while trying to reach us. Which gave me an idea. Quickly! Block the streets with wood and anything that will burn, I commanded. We dragged carts over and overturned them in the streets, creating a different kind of dam. When the orcs started running up to it, we torched the wood. Then we threw torches atop the surrounding buildings. Only then did we mount our horses and start shooting arrows into the orcs. For the first time ever, I saw orcs turn around and run away. I wasn't fooled. They would just come at us from a different direction. Let's go, my friends, I called, gathering my little troop. Well done. I'm proud of you. They grinned, laughed, whooped, and hollered. I've never seen men so joyful in a battle. One elf was so happy tears bathed his face. Got a little misty-eyed myself for a second. We rode hard through that burning city. The smoke was horrible in places. Great whirlwinds of superheated air and flames rose up above some buildings. I could see the raging fires leaping from building to building, quickly spreading through the city. The greatest immediate threat to the escaping elves, humans, and goblins were the Orcish guards at the nearby gatehouse and upon the walls up to the breach. I led my troop around the rampaging horde of escaping slaves, eagerly burning and destroying everything as they went, and rode straight to the gatehouse. The orcs looked beside themselves. I don't think they were afraid, but rather had to protect the gate while wanting to go attack the escapees. Poor fellows were torn. So I helped them out by killing them. I led my little troop up, and we rained death upon them. Then we broke the crank that lifted the portcullis. Ride to the breach and shoot all of the orcs on the walls, I commanded, and kicked my horse into a run. Honestly, it was more of a slaughter. Maybe the first time the orcs had ever been on the receiving end of such carnage. We outnumbered them, and we killed from a distance. I wasn't stupid enough to meet them toe to toe. Thankfully, none of my troopers were that stupid either. We stood guard at the breach until the last of the now former slaves passed through the breach, and then we dismounted and carefully walked out mounts through the decades-old debris. I was amazed that the orcs were so casual about wall repair. They'd barely cleaned the area up after the war. I'm not sure we could have gotten our mounts through if the slaves hadn't been using the stone debris as building materials for their masters. I would have never forced a horse through there if we weren't so desperate. Once outside the city walls, I had to smile. Before me were many dark lines of people streaming up the side of the surrounding hills. The head of the columns were already over the top and lost to sight. Best of all, everyone looked to be going in the right direction. Hang back, I commanded my horse warriors. We are the rear guard. The castle bell started ringing again. Really, I didn't even realize it had stopped until it started up again. I was kind of distracted. There was only one reason to start ringing the bell again. The orcs figured out the slaves were escaping. Yeah, I had a little bit of a panic attack. Faster! The orcs are coming! I cried. They were going as fast as they could. Everyone was burdened with food and water. They could move faster if they shucked their loads, but they would die a slower death in the desert. My task was to keep them alive for as long as possible, and pray it was long enough to reach freedom. I remembered it took a week to reach El Shardin from the border. The orcs weren't walking that fast, though. They were not in a hurry. I figured we could make the border in 3-4 days at most. At least I could. Some of those slaves were in bad shape. Breaking the western gate might slow the orcs a little, but I could see 3 breaches from my location. Then I saw Orcish warriors starting to trickle out through the breaches. Damn! What do we do, princess? Garth asked. First, stop calling me princess. I looked around, gnawing on my lip. I'm Duvessa, Garth. You'll always be my princess, he said, kind of choking up. And my hero. You, sir, are a silver-tongued rogue, I teased, feeling a little uncomfortable. But we have work to do. I quickly assigned small groups places to set up for the approaching fight. We'll hold the high ground as long as we can, then fall back. How long can we do that? An elf asked. Until we're dead or in Mayor, I replied. There are no other options. The 300 or so escapees were out of sight now. My troop divided up into teams of 3. Each of us defended one of the trails. I teamed up with Garth in the middle. Don't waste your arrows. I'll tell you when to start shooting, I called out. We're going to let them get close. Every arrow has to count. To the orcs' credit, they never faltered. Those crazy bastards charged up that hill, never hesitating or slowing down. The leaders were almost to the top before I gave the command. Kill them! I released arrow after arrow into those murderous monsters. And they kept coming. And coming. Fortunately, the hill, the dead, and the dying started slowing them down. Eventually, the remaining orcs realized the futility of charging up those trails and fell back to attack from another direction. Well done! I shouted. Fall back! Fall back! I was pleased to see that the bulk of the escapees were to the next ridge of hills. We were beginning to have stragglers, though. I ordered my troopers to relieve the stragglers of their loads. The horses would have to carry more weight than just us. Duvessa, I'm almost out of arrows, Garth said. Me, too, I said with a sigh. We'll have to trade spears for arrows with some of the women in the group ahead. How long will that last before we're completely out? Probably not long enough, I said. I nudged my mount into a quicker gait. Come on. Let's go restock. We haven't seen the last of the orcs this night. Chapter 9. 3 days later. At least we tried, Colin said. He sounded soul-sick and exhausted. "I'm not finished trying, my friend," I replied, trying to sound hopeful. There had to be 1,000 orcs at the base of the hill. They were well within arrow range, but we'd spent our last arrow the previous day. Of my 20 horse warriors, only Garth and I still lived. Worse, the 300 or so that escaped were down to around 200. We weren't even halfway to the border. The desert sun hurt us more than the pursuing orcs. Half our dead were from heat stroke. Many of the remaining were sick and dying. I gathered us atop that hill because the group wasn't really able to continue. It was last stand time. "You're still young and strong, Devesa," Garth said. He was in bad shape, with his head wrapped in a bloody bandage and part of his left hand now missing. "With your horse, I don't think the orcs can catch you." "He's right," Colin said. "Go. Tell the elves that we tried. We just weren't strong enough." I tried so hard to be strong and stoic for them. My eyes betrayed me, getting so hot and wet. I failed. I led them to their deaths. Just because I believed death before slavery didn't mean they did. "I led you here, my friends," I whispered, throat too tight to speak normally. I hated it when I got like that. We live and escape together, or we die together. "I don't want you to die," Garth said, starting to cry. "No one wants to die," I said. I looked around at all the people staring at us. I raised my voice. "If I must die today, then there is no greater honor than to die with you." "We fight," someone called. "Yes. We fight to the last man, and make them hurt for generations. They will never forget us. They will frighten their children with tales of our uprising." A cheer went up. Not a very loud or strong cheer, but it was full of feeling. Our mood was killed when the Orcish battle drums thundered to life. The orcs started lining up in battle formations. I noticed Colin look past them, and then I saw the other orcs approaching. There had to be another 2,000. "Seems like overkill to me," I said. "When it comes to killing, orcs are very thorough," Colin said. "It's a point of pride for them. They're savages. Another point of pride for them." I glanced at him. Colin shrugged. "Here they come," a woman cried. "All right, everyone," I shouted. "Remember what I taught you. We might not win this fight, but we're going to kill a lot more of them before we go down." Over the last few days I taught them some simple elfin infantry tactics. Nothing too complicated. We no longer had any missile weapons. I wouldn't allow them to throw away their spears, since they were excellent stabbing weapons. There were rocks, but we didn't have any slings or anything to make slings out of. Blades were few, and mostly long knives and a few sabers. The men and women were mixed together and lined up in 3 ranks, about 3/4 the way up the hill. That was just above the steepest part, so the best place to hit the charging orcs. Colin, Garth, and I were right behind them. The remaining food and water was piled up behind us. "Try to maintain your ranks. Listen for my commands," I called. "And fight like hellcats." Everyone had a spear. No shields or armor, though. They looked grim, but determined. I don't think anyone expected to survive the first Orcish attack. "Dismount, Garth," I said. I started removing the makeshift bridle. "At least we can set the horses free. The orcs will just eat them." Once my gear was stripped off the mare, I swatted her rump. She took off like an arrow, going the rest of the way up and over the hill. "To freedom." "Good luck," I whispered. Turning around, I assessed the situation. It wasn't good. The orcs were already halfway up the hill. They weren't running, but moving up steadily. I was impressed at their discipline. Folk must be trying to create a real army, as opposed to the usual Orcish horde mentality in battle. That could not be good for the kingdom of Mayer. As the Orcish warriors scrambled up the last, steepest incline, I commanded, "First rank. Present arms. Charge." They lowered their spears and charged forward with wild battle cries. The orcs didn't have armor, and they weren't in a position to even fight. My little slave army smashed them back, but the orcs surged forward, forcing the first rank back. Men and women starting falling to Orcish blades and maces. Second rank. Present arms. I cried. They lowered their spears. Charge. That was also the signal for the first rank to fall back. That opened up a gap between us and the orcs, which confused the orcs for a second. Then the second rank raced through the gaps in the first rank, to crash into the orcs. Again, the orcs were forced back, only to surge forward again. Third rank. Charge. Cullen, Garth, and I charged in with the third rank. I drove my spear into the throat of an orc. Then stabbed another in the belly. He doubled over and seized my spear in his hands, taking it away from me. I pulled Fong and stabbed another, and another. First rank. Charge. I cried, as my rank fell back. A second later the first rank passed us to hit the orcs. That time the orcs didn't give any ground. We continued to hit them, with fewer and fewer fighters. Yet, they pushed us up the hill until we stood at the peak. A shadow moved over us, feeling nice. If I had to die, I'd rather do it in the shade of a friendly cloud. We were all too tired to continue our attacks. Most of my people were leaning over huffing and puffing. I was the only one there with recent military training and exercise. The orcs didn't look the least bit tired, but had fallen back halfway down the hill to regroup after their last attack. They started back up the hill, their war drums shaking the air. "Here they come," Colin rasped out. "Oh well, at least we die free. Everyone. You made me very proud today. You fought like real warriors," I called, eyes hot and tears rolling down my cheeks. There is no greater bravery, no greater honor than to fight impossible odds. Today, we teach the orcs the meaning of, what the... The air was thumping. I could hear it. I felt it in my chest. I knew that sound. It was the song of elfin direhawks flying in formation. I turned to find the sky black with direhawks. My mother's voice thundered across the battlefield, "First Regiment. Begin your battle run, ... We're saved." I cried. A line of direhawks came in low, carrying bundles of stones. "Drop to the ground," I commanded. We hit the ground just before the direhawks passed over, and then released their loads of head-sized stones. Those heavy rocks rained down upon the front lines of orcs, bouncing down through the remaining Orcish warriors. And then another and another line hit them. The ground shook and the sound was like the deep ground thunder of an earthquake. That's when I heard the shouts and screams of dying orcs. Lifting my head, I found the remaining elfin air cavalry raining arrows down on the Orcish army. "Look," Garth said, pointing to the west. "Cavalry." Marin heavy cavalry and knights were riding our way. There had to be at least 5,000 of them. "We're saved, ... We're free." Everyone was jumping up and down, laughing, dancing, crying. I just knelt there, looking up at my people, and cried. I didn't care if it ruined my reputation as a brave and stark warrior and officer. I couldn't stop crying. And then Colin and Garth enveloped me in a group hug, and we all sobbed like babies. Chapter 10. We all gathered in a plain about an hour from the battle site. The elfin air cavalry and their direhawks formed a semicircle to the west, with the human horse cavalry finishing the circle to the east. Me and my ragtag troop of escaped slaves stood in the middle, facing the elfin and human nobility. I stood front and center with Colin to my right and Garth to my left. High Lady Maeve stepped forward and looked us over. My heart swelled with such love and pride. She was glorious in her silvery elfin armor, wearing the eagle helm and her long golden hair flowing below it. I don't think she ever looked more majestic and powerful. She was forever and always my hero. "Devesa, you look, well," she said. "I am now," I replied. I bowed. "Your most serene highness, I thank you for saving my friends from vile Orcish slavery. I am forever in your debt." "Oh, hush," she said, and rushed towards me. We met halfway. I'm not sure how long we hugged and kissed, but I suspect it was getting uncomfortable for the others. "Mother," I said, breaking free and directing her attention to the former slaves. "I beg you do all you can for my friends, who have suffered so terribly and for so long." "They helped my daughter escape the orcs," she said, and hugged me again. "They will all be richly rewarded, and we will help them adjust to their new lives as much as possible." "So, the ransom you were prepared to pay the orcs, you will divide among them?" Mother hesitated, looked surprised, but then reluctantly nodded. "Of course. If that is your wish." I took a step towards the stunned-looking escapees. "My friends, rest while food is prepared. Then we will raise a mug in honor and memory of our fallen friends, whose sacrifice made this all possible. Then we will feast and celebrate their lives and our hard-won freedom. And we will get roaring drunk." "Yes," they cried, starting to tearfully hug each other. My mother gave a senior officer a meaningful look, and she hurried away to begin setting up the feast I just promised. I bet they loved that. They probably didn't have much food with them, but anything they had would be the best food most of the escaped slaves ever had. And the elfin army always carried wine. And the humans probably brought even stronger drink. "I'm impressed," Devesa, Mother said. "It would have been so much easier to escape alone. You took a great risk helping them escape." "I know," I said inside. "I couldn't leave them behind." "Good," she said. "Maybe I haven't entirely failed as a mother." I'm not sure how to take that," I replied and grinned. "But I do make your life interesting. You have to give me that." "Yes," she said, shaking her head. Her eyes locked on my nose. "Please, remove that vile nose stud." "Why?" "It was the talisman that held you in bondage," she said. "I saw what it was the instant I laid eyes on you in the king's court." "True, but its enchantment was destroyed in the magical backblast caused by King Folk's ill-advised destruction of the messenger stone," I said. Mother cringed. "Bet that hurt." "Knocked me out cold," she said, and shivered. "Honestly, my head still hurts a little." "Sorry," I said. I touched the nose stud. "Truth is, I think I need it for a little longer to remind me of my ordeal, and that I'm not invincible." "I'm impressed. Maybe being captured actually taught you something," she said. I almost messed up. My first thought to say was, "I learned that orcs really can keep it up all night long." But my mother didn't want to hear that. "Oh no. I try to learn from all of my mistakes," I said. Giving her another hug, I continued, "I hope you don't mind, but I'd really like to return to my friends. It's been very traumatic for them." Then as an afterthought, some wine would be nice. "Devesa," they cried when I rejoined them. I found myself being hugged over and over again. We laughed and giggled, hugged and cried. Mostly they looked around with incredulous eyes. They were free, many for the first time in their lives. I think it was the happiest day of my life. The end. Back to table of contents. Please consider leaving a review on the site where you purchased this story, or comment directly to him via email. You can contact Warren at war_Thomas@outlook.com. Check out these other books by Warren Thomas. The Elfmaid Trilogy. The Elfmaid's Curse. Into Lands Forbidden. Way of the Warrior. Elfin Magic. Under a Werewolf Moon. Harem of the Orc King. About the author. Warren Thomas is an IT professional by day and a dreamer by night. While serving a tour of duty with the army in Germany, he found himself in daily contact with castles, cathedrals, and city walls. His imagination erupted, and he's been writing fantasy adventures ever since. Table of Contents. Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Chapter 10. List of other books by Warren. About the author. Back to Table of Contents.